She ran through the dark with her father's blood still on her hands. Not hers, but his. And the only thing left of him was a folded letter she pressed against her ribs like a wound. They had taken everything. His land, his name, his life. And now they were coming for her. If you've ever been wronged and had no one believe you, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story traveled. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Abigail Turner read twice, standing in the cold kitchen of her father's house in Jefferson City. The candle burning low beside her, the ink still sharp enough to cut. It wasn't the words that broke her. She had already read words like these before, formal, clipped, legal. It was the signature at the bottom. Judge Harlan Price, a man her father had called a friend. The court finds no grounds for further investigation into the death of federal judge Ugliest Turner. Ruled natural causes. Case closed. Natural causes. Her father had been found face down in the Missouri River with a fractured skull and both his hands bound behind his back. She folded the letter once, then again. Then she pressed it flat against the table with both palms and stood very still the way a person stands when they're deciding whether to scream or to survive. She chose survival. But survival, she was learning, had a cost she hadn't yet calculated. 3 days later, they came for the house. She heard them before she saw them, boots on the porch, the low murmur of men who didn't bother to be quiet because they'd already decided the outcome. 2 of them. Big. Wearing the silver star of Silas Blackwood's private land company, which wasn't a real badge, but might as well have been in Red Creek County. Abigail was already dressed. She had not slept. Miss Turner. The taller one tipped his hat without a trace of courtesy. Mr. Blackwood's asked us to inform you that the deed on this property has been transferred to the Blackwood Land Trust effective this morning. You've got until sundown to gather your belongings. She looked at him the way her father had taught her to look at men who lied in daylight. Steady chin level, not a flinch. My father owned this house outright, she said. I have the original deed signed by the Federal Registrar in 1809. Yes, ma'am. He reached into his coat and produced a document folded thick. And this is the amended deed co-signed by Judge Price, transferring ownership in settlement of your father's alleged debts to the Blackwood Trust. All legal, all witnessed. Alleged debts. Her father had never owed Silas Blackwood a single cent. He had spent the last 8 months of his life documenting exactly how much Silas Blackwood owed others, hundreds of Missouri settlers, farmers, veterans, widows, whose land had been quietly swallowed by forged registration certificates and crooked notarizations. And then her father had gone to present that documentation to the Federal Circuit Court. And then her father had turned up dead in the river. Get out of my house, Abigail said quietly. Ma'am. I said get out. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. You have delivered your message. I have heard it. Now get off my porch before I start screaming, and we can find out together how many of my father's neighbors still remember what he stood for. The 2 men exchanged a look. The taller one folded the document back into his coat. Sundown, Miss Turner, he said. And they left. She waited until she heard their horses on the road. Then she walked to the corner of her father's study, pried up the loose floorboard he had shown her when she was 12 years old, and removed the tin box he had hidden there. Inside, a leather journal. 67 pages of dates, names, parcel numbers, forged signatures, and cross-referenced land registrations going back 11 years. Her father's handwriting patient, and exact the way he wrote everything. Evidence he had said must be unimpeachable, Abigail. Emotion clouds. Documentation endures. She pressed her thumb against his handwriting for just a moment. Then she closed the box, wrapped it in 2 layers of oilcloth, and began to think about how to disappear. She made it 40 miles before they caught up with her. Not Silas's men, worse. Bounty hunters. 2 of them hired, she guessed, by Victoria Blackwood. Silas's older sister, who had her own reasons to want Ugliest Turner's daughter. Silenced. Victoria ran the most elegant establishment in Red Creek. Part saloon, part land brokerage, part social club for men who liked to feel powerful. She had been the one to introduce her brother to Judge Price. She had been the one Abigail suspected who had suggested that Elias Turner's death look accidental. The horse threw a shoe outside a creek crossing at dusk. The hunters were behind her within the hour. She heard them before she saw them, the crack of a branch, the soft, deliberate hush of men moving through brush, and she ran. She ran until her boots were soaked through and her lungs burned, and the tin box was pressed so hard under her arm it had bruised her ribs. She ran until the lights of a distant farmhouse appeared through the trees, and even then, she didn't stop running because stopping felt like dying, and she wasn't ready to die. She hit the porch railing at a dead sprint. The front door opened before she could knock. Wyatt Callahan stood in the doorframe with a rifle in one hand and a lamp in the other, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he wasn't expecting and isn't sure what to do with. He was tall, wide through the shoulder. His face was the kind that had been weathered into something harder than it started. Not cruel, not kind, just resolved. Like a man who had made every important decision already and was no longer interested in making new ones. He said nothing. She said nothing. Then she heard the horses on the road. "Please," she said. It was the word she hated most. She had not used it in 3 days. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me stand inside your door for 5 minutes." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped aside. She walked in. He closed the door behind her, set the lamp on the table, and moved to the window. She stood in the middle of his kitchen, with mud on her boots and river water on her hem, and her father's journal pressed against her ribs, and she watched him watch the road outside. 2 riders passed, slow, looking. They kept going. Neither of them spoke until the sound of hooves had faded completely. Then Wyatt Callahan set his rifle against the wall, crossed his arms, and looked at her. "You want to tell me who you are?" he said. "Or would you rather I just guess?" "I'd rather you didn't ask," she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Not quite anything. "You hungry?" She hadn't eaten in 16 hours. "No," she said. He turned to the stove anyway. His name she learned from the hired hand she met at breakfast. A weathered older man named Cleet, who called his employer Mr. Callahan with a tone that suggested both genuine respect and the quiet understanding that some questions weren't worth asking. Wyatt Callahan. Widower. Former cavalry officer. Owner of the largest working cattle operation in Red Creek County, 3,000 acres running north from the creek bend, 12 full-time hands. A reputation for fair dealing and absolutely no patience for anything he considered foolish. He had been, as far as Cleet described him, the most sought-after bachelor in 3 counties until the death of his wife 4 years ago. After which he had Cleet's words closed up like a house before a hard winter, and nobody's gotten a window open since. Abigail sat at the kitchen table and ate cold biscuits and listened and said very little. She had given Wyatt her name as Alice. Alice Gray. A widow from St. Louis, looking for domestic work, moving west to find a fresh start. It was a thin story. She knew it. She suspected he knew it too. But he had not pressed her the night before, and he did not press her now, and that restraint unsettled her more than questions would have. She was used to men who pushed, men who demanded, men who treated information as something to be extracted. She was not used to men who waited. 3 days after she arrived, Wyatt Callahan came to find her in the washhouse and said without preamble, "I need a second housemaid. Mine quit last week. Pays fair, quarters are private, and I don't ask personal questions." He paused. "I also don't answer many." Abigail wrung out a shirt and didn't look at him. "Why me?" she said. "Because you work hard and you don't talk too much," he said. "In my experience, those 2 things together are rarer than people think." She thought about the tin box wrapped in oilcloth currently buried under the floorboards of the room Cleet had given her. She thought about Silas Blackwood's men still searching. She thought about her father's handwriting patient and exact and what it had cost him. "I'll stay," she said. She did not say for how long. Neither did he. What she had not counted on was how difficult it would be to be invisible in a house this size. She had planned it carefully. Keep her head down. Speak only when spoken to. Dress plainly. Move quietly. Let the work be her armor, and there was plenty of work. The Callahan house ran on a rhythm as precise as a courthouse calendar, and she fell into it, grateful for the structure. Grateful, too, for the calluses that formed on her palms, which felt like proof she was still alive. But Wyatt Callahan noticed things. She hadn't expected that. He noticed when she corrected Cleet's account ledger without being asked, her hand moving automatically to the column error, ink drying before she realized what she'd done. She looked up to find Wyatt in the doorway watching. "Sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to." "Cleet's been making that same carry error for 6 years, Wyatt said. "Nobody's caught it before." He left before she could answer. He noticed when she quoted land measurement to one of the hands settling a property line dispute. A specific legal standard, chapter and statute, the kind of thing a federal judge's daughter would have heard at supper tables her whole life without realizing she was learning it. The hand looked at her confused and grateful. Wyatt said nothing. But later that evening, she looked up from the supper dishes to find him watching her from the far end of the room with an expression she couldn't read, not suspicion exactly. More like a man who has picked up a stone and found it heavier than it looks. She began after that to be more careful. She was not careful enough. It was the letter that nearly undid her. One of the supply riders brought mail into Red Creek on Thursdays, and among the week's deliveries was a Missouri Territory circular printed out of Jefferson City that she caught a glimpse of as it passed through the kitchen. She kept walking, kept her face blank. But she had seen enough. Her own name, Abigail Turner. A description. Wanted for questioning in connection with the theft of private legal documents from the estate of the late Judge Elias Turner. Believed to be traveling under a false identity. Considered potentially dangerous. Reward offered by the Blackwood Land Trust. Dangerous. She almost laughed. She sat on the edge of her bed that night with the oilcloth bundle in her lap, and her father's journal open to the last entry he had ever made, and she read it the way she had read it 100 times. His hand had been shaking when he wrote it. She could see it in the unsteadiness of the letters, something that was never true of her father's writing. "I have made arrangements for Abigail to be informed if something happens. I have also made arrangements for the documents to reach federal hands if that time comes. I do not believe Silas Blackwood understands what he has started. Men who build empires on paper believe that paper is what matters. They have forgotten that witnesses matter more." She pressed the journal against her chest and breathed very slowly. Witnesses, she thought. I need witnesses. She had no idea, sitting there in the dark of a stranger's farmhouse with bounty hunters still somewhere on the road, that the most important witness she would find was already asleep in the room at the end of the hall. A widower with a closed face and a rifle by his door, and absolutely no patience for foolishness. And no idea, not yet, what it was going to cost him to believe her. On her 11th day at the Callahan Ranch, Silas Blackwood rode through Red Creek. She heard about it from the kitchen, one of the hands coming in for water talking loudly to Cleet about the big procession, the fine horses, the way Blackwood sat his saddle like a man who expected the road to smooth itself out ahead of him. She kept her hands in the dishwater and her eyes on the window. "He's staying at Victoria's place," the hand said. "Word is he's looking for someone." Cleet said, "Ain't he always?" The hand laughed and went back outside. Abigail let out a breath so careful it barely moved the air. 11 days. 11 days of learning this house, this man, this county. 11 days of watching Wyatt Callahan run 3,000 acres with the same quiet authority her father had brought to a courtroom. Not loud, not cruel, just utterly certain. She had watched him stand between a frightened farmhand and an angry creditor and say simply, "This man works for me. His debt is his own business. You'll take that argument off my land." She had watched him leave food on the back step every Thursday evening for a family of settlers. she'd been told had lost their land 2 summers back quietly without ceremony, because ceremony would have embarrassed everyone. She had watched him and tried not to feel anything. She was not entirely succeeding, but none of that mattered now. Silas was in Red Creek, which meant her 11 days of borrowed safety were likely already numbered. She dried her hands. She went back to work. And somewhere behind her in the doorway, she hadn't heard open, Wyatt Callahan stood holding the Missouri Circular with her name on it, reading it for the second time, his face entirely still. He did not move for a long while. Then he folded the paper, put it in his coat pocket, and walked back out to the yard. He did not say anything that evening, nor the next morning. He was waiting. She didn't know for what. Wyatt said nothing at breakfast. He said nothing through the morning either. Not when she brought coffee to the study, not when she passed him in the yard, not when their paths crossed at the water pump. And she stepped aside, and he stepped aside, and for one suspended moment, they were simply two people pretending very hard not to see each other. She had spent the night running calculations. Silas was in Red Creek. The circular with her name had been in the house for at least 12 hours. Wyatt had said nothing, which meant one of 3 things: he hadn't seen it. He had seen it and was deciding what to do, or he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. None of those options gave her much comfort. She went about her work. She made beds. She swept floors. She kept her hands busy and her face neutral, and her mind running quiet and fast beneath the surface the way her father had taught her. Don't let them see you calculating, Abigail. Let them think you're not thinking at all. It was the hardest lesson he had ever given her. It was the most useful. By mid-morning, she had decided if Wyatt hadn't moved by nightfall, she would move herself. Take the journal. Take the horse she'd been quietly learning the temperament of for the past week. Ride north toward St. Louis and find a federal man she could trust, if such a thing still existed in Missouri territory. She was measuring flour when Cleet came into the kitchen and set a folded piece of paper on the counter beside her without a word. She looked at it. Her name was on the outside, not Alice Gray, her real name, Abigail. She didn't reach for it immediately. She kept measuring. "Who gave you that?" she said. "Man who pays my wages," Cleet said, and left. She put down the measuring cup. She unfolded the paper. It was not an accusation. It was not a threat. It was 4 lines written in the same direct hand she had seen in his ledgers. "I know who you are. I also know who your father was. If you're still here at supper, I'll take that as your answer. If you're gone, I won't look for you. But I think you should stay, W.C." She read it 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and pressed it flat between her palms, and stood at the kitchen counter for a long time, staring at nothing. He knew. He had known how long since the circular, certainly, maybe longer. And he had not gone to the sheriff. He had not sent for Silas's men. He had written her a note and left the choice entirely to her. She stayed. He found her on the back porch after supper, the last of the evening light cutting long and flat across the yard. She heard him come out and didn't turn around. "You could have turned me in," she said. "There's a reward." "I don't need the money," he said. "That's not the point." "No," he agreed. "It's not." He stood beside her, not close enough to crowd, far enough to leave her room. She had noticed he did that, gave people room. It was either a courtesy or a habit. With Wyatt Callahan, she was beginning to understand that most of his courtesies were habits he had decided on deliberately, which made them more meaningful, not less. "How did you know my father?" she asked. "I didn't. Not personally." He was quiet a moment. "He ruled on a land case 3 years back. Man named Burl Sutter, down in Cooper County. Blackwood had gotten hold of his deed somehow, same way he gets hold of most things. Your father was the only judge in 2 circuits who looked at the registration papers and said they didn't add up." He paused. "Burl got to keep his land. He died 2 winters ago, fever, but his widow's still there. She's got 3 kids. Abigail looked at her hands. "My father spent 11 years on that bench," she said. "He had 83 cases involving forged land registrations, He documented every single one. "Where's the documentation now?" "Safe," she said. He nodded. He did not ask where. She noted that too. "Silas is going to come here," she said. "Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but once he's satisfied I'm not in Jefferson City, he'll start working outward. Red Creek is a logical stop." "I know. That puts you at risk, Miss Turner." He turned to look at her then, and she made herself meet his eyes. They were the color of creek water she thought, gray and clear and deeper than they looked at first. "I've been at risk since I started refusing to sell to Blackwood 3 years ago. That's not a new condition for me." She opened her mouth and he shook his head slightly. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll figure the rest out in the morning." He went inside. She stayed on the porch until dark. For the first time in 2 weeks, she let herself breathe all the way down. But morning brought trouble before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. One of the younger hands, a boy named Eli, barely 17, with an unfortunate habit of talking faster than he thought, came bursting into the kitchen while she was still at the stove with news that 2 men had been asking about her in town. Not about Alice Gray. About a woman matching her description. Dark hair, slight build, carrying a satchel, traveling alone. She set down the coffee pot very carefully. "Who were they asking?" she said. "Everybody," Eli said. "Henderson's Dry Goods, the post office, old Mrs. Crane at the boarding house." He caught Abigail's expression and seemed to realize, slightly late, that this might not be purely conversational news. I didn't say nothing, miss. I swear. I don't even... I figured..." "You figured right," she said. "Don't mention it to anyone else. Go on about your day." He went. She turned to find Wyatt in the doorway. "I heard," he said. "I have to move," she said. "If they're canvassing the whole town, moving will confirm you're here. Staying might get you killed." He crossed his arms. He had that look again, the one that meant he was working through something and wasn't going to be hurried. It made her want to shake him. "Silas doesn't move on people directly," Wyatt said. "He's too careful. He works through legal structures, fraudulent ones, but legal enough to hold up in a county court. He'll try to get the sheriff to bring you in. He needs you visible to do that." He looked at her. "If you run, you become visible. If you stay and stay quiet, you're just a maid. I'm on a wanted circular, which about 6 people in this county have actually read." She stared at him. He was either the calmest man she had ever met or the most reckless. She genuinely could not tell which. "If it goes wrong," she said, "it goes wrong for both of us." "I've been in worse positions," he said. When something shifted in his face. Quick. Gone before she could read it properly. "Missouri River Campaign, winter of 12, he said. 3 days without supply lines and a colonel who'd lost his nerve." He picked up his hat from the table. "This is considerably more manageable." He walked out. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the space where he had been. Then, despite every sensible instinct she had, she felt the corner of her mouth move. She turned back to the stove. HUD. The first real threat arrived on a Thursday, 8 days after Silas came to Red Creek. It came in the form of Victoria Blackwood. Abigail knew about Victoria by reputation. Every woman in the territory did. Silas's older sister was what men called formidable, and what women called something considerably less flattering. She had built the most profitable establishment in 3 counties from nothing, which Abigail might have respected under different circumstances, except that what Victoria had built it on was the same systematic theft and manipulation her brother practiced, just with better furniture and a lower neckline. Victoria arrived at the Callahan Ranch in a private carriage, which in itself was a statement. Nobody drove a private carriage on unpaved ranch roads unless they were trying to make a point about not caring about the carriage. Abigail was hanging laundry in the side yard when it arrived. She heard the wheels. She kept her head down and her hands moving. She heard Victoria's voice from the front of the house, bright and carrying, and shaped like a compliment, but edged like a blade. "Wyatt, darling, I simply had to stop by. Silas sends his regards. He's hoping you'll reconsider his offer on the north pasture. Abigail moved toward the back of the yard. Not fast enough. And who is this? The voice had swung like a compass needle. Abigail felt it before she heard it, the specific prickling of being assessed by someone who assessed for sport. She turned. Victoria Blackwood was perhaps 40, dressed as though Red Creek were a city and the road were a stage. She stood at the corner of the house with Wyatt a step behind her, and she was looking at Abigail the way a woman looks at something that doesn't fit and is trying to determine whether it's threatening or merely irritating. "New maid," Wyatt said from behind her, flat, uninformative. Victoria tilted her head. "What's your name, girl?" "Alice, ma'am." Abigail kept her eyes low. "Less interesting. Be less interesting." "Alice Gray." "Where are you from?" "St. Louis, ma'am." "St. Louis." Victoria repeated it the way people repeat something they don't believe. "Funny. You don't sound like St. Louis." "I grew up in the country," Abigail said. Before. Victoria smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. "Well, everyone has a before, don't they?" She turned back to Wyatt, dismissed and re-engaging in the same motion. "She's a bit pale for ranch work, Wyatt. You ought to make sure she's eating." "I'll keep that in mind," Wyatt said. Victoria stayed another half hour. Abigail heard the conversation through the kitchen window while she worked the careful social dance of two people who distrusted each other completely and were both too disciplined to show it. Victoria pressed on the north pasture. Wyatt declined politely, immovably. Victoria shifted to compliments and small social news. Wyatt received these without reciprocating. When she finally left, the sound of the carriage wheels was the best thing Abigail had heard all week. Wyatt came into the kitchen 3 minutes later. "She made you," he said. "I don't think so," Abigail said. "Not for certain." "She doesn't need certainty." He pulled out a chair and sat down, which was unusual. He rarely sat in the middle of the day. It meant he was thinking hard. Victoria works on suspicion. She collects suspicious things the way other people collect furniture. If you stay in her memory, she'll eventually figure out where she's seen you. Have I stayed in her memory? He considered. Probably. Abigail sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "My father's journal has everything," she said. 67 pages. Names, dates, forged certificate numbers, cross-referenced against the original federal registrations. It would be enough if it reached the right hands. What hands? Federal Circuit. Not the local court Price is bought. But the Federal Circuit convenes in St. Louis in September. If I could get the documentation to a federal marshal before then. September is 7 weeks. I know. He leaned back in the chair. His hands were flat on the table, the gesture she had learned of a man working through a problem from every angle before he committed to any of them. "Tell me exactly what's in the journal," he said. So she told him. It took the better part of an hour. She was precise. She had memorized most of it the way her father had trained her to memorize things that mattered, because memory, Abigail, cannot be seized and burned, and she laid it out the way he had laid it out methodically, beginning with the first forged registration in 1808 and working forward through 11 years of systematic theft. Names of victims, specific acreages, certificate numbers, the notaries who had signed falsified documents, the 2 county clerks who had accepted bribes, Judge Price's signature appearing on documents that should never have passed through a federal judge's desk. Wyatt listened without interrupting, without note-taking, his eyes on the table, then on her, then the table again. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Your father built this case for 11 years, he finally said. "And they killed him for it." "They killed him for it," she agreed. He looked at her directly. "And you've been carrying it alone." It wasn't a question. It also wasn't pity. She would have flinched at pity. It was something closer to acknowledgement. Recognition. The look of a man who understood what it meant to carry something heavy and not put it down because putting it down would mean accepting that it was too heavy. She looked away before she could feel too much of it. "I'm not alone anymore," she said quietly. Apparently, he didn't respond to that. But when he stood and picked up his hat from the table, he paused with his hand on the doorframe and said without turning around, "Burl Sutter's widow. Her name is Clara. She kept every piece of paper she had from the case. Your father's correspondence. The original ruling. Everything." Abigail looked up. "She's 40 miles north," Wyatt said, "and she's been waiting for 3 years for someone to tell her it mattered." He stepped through the door. "I think it's time she heard it." He left the next morning before she was awake, and didn't tell her where he was going, and she spent the entire day in a state of tightly controlled anxiety that she expressed by reorganizing the kitchen pantry with the precision of a military campaign, and then scrubbing the kitchen floor on her hands and knees until it was cleaner than it had been since the house was built. Cleet watched this from the doorway with visible concern. "You always clean like you're angry at the dirt," he said. "I'm not angry," she said. "Uh-huh." She looked up. Cleet was old enough and honest enough that she had stopped pretending with him 3 days in. He simply looked at her until pretending seemed like more trouble than it was worth. "Where did he go?" she asked. "Clara Sutter's place," Cleet said. "Same place he goes every time he needs to remember why something's worth doing." He paused. "He won't say that. He'd say he went for business. But that's where he goes." She sat back on her heels. "He lost people too," she said slowly. "Didn't he?" "His wife grew up on the land next door to the Sutter place," Cleet said, "before Blackwood got hold of it." He shrugged the shrug of a man who had lived long enough to accept that the world was full of things that shouldn't have happened and mostly did anyway. "Some griefs run in the same direction, that's all." She looked down at the clean floor. Some griefs run in the same direction. She was still thinking about that when she heard horses on the road. Multiple horses moving fast, and her stomach dropped straight through the clean floor beneath her. There were 4 of them. Not bounty hunters this time. Actual sheriff's deputies, or men wearing deputy badges, which in Red Creek County was sometimes the same thing, and sometimes emphatically was not. They pulled up in the yard, and the lead one, a thick-necked man she didn't know, called out for the owner of the property. Cleet came out. Abigail stayed inside, pressed against the wall beside the kitchen window where she could hear everything. "Callahan ain't here," Cleet said. "What's your business?" "We're looking for a woman," the deputy said. "Name of Abigail Turner. Wanted for questioning theft of legal documents. We got information she may be in this area." "I see," Cleet said. His voice hadn't changed at all. It had the same weathered flatness as always. "And who gave you that information?" "That ain't your concern. We'd like to search the premises." "You got a warrant?" A pause. "We don't need a in this county," Cleet said. "On private property you do. You know that as well as I do, deputy. Mr. Callahan's not here to give permission, and I'm not authorized to give it in his absence." Another pause. "You want to wait for him? You're welcome to do that." The deputy said something she couldn't hear. Then horses shifted, and there was the sound of debate, low frustrated, and then hooves moving away. She let out her breath against the wall. Cleet came in through the back door, moved to the stove, poured himself a cup of coffee with absolute steadiness, and did not look at her. "They'll be back," he said. "I know," she said. "With a warrant maybe, or maybe with enough men that the warrant stops mattering." He sipped his coffee. "Either way, you've got maybe 2 days." She looked at the window. The yard was empty. "Then I need Wyatt back here tonight," she said. Cleet nodded once, went to the door, whistled for Eli. "Get your Pierre." Wyatt rode in at dusk, with mud on his boots and something different in his face. Not lighter exactly. He wasn't a man whose face went light but settled, the look of someone who had resolved something that had been unresolved for a long time. Cleet met him at the gate and spoke to him quietly. Abigail watched from the porch and saw the moment the information landed, a slight stillness, a breath that didn't quite come, and then the pivot toward the house. He came up the steps and she said before he could speak, "They'll come back with a warrant. I have 2 days at most." Maybe less, he said. Silas is still in town. That means Victoria's working the social angles and Silas is working the legal ones. 2 days is optimistic. Then I should leave tonight. No. Wyatt. Clara Sutter is coming here, he said. She stopped. She has papers, Abigail. Correspondence from your father dating back 3 years documenting his concerns about Blackwood's land trust long before his death. Letters he sent to her because he needed a witness outside the court system, someone Blackwood wouldn't think to watch. He held her gaze. She's also got 2 neighbors willing to sign sworn statements about land they lost. And I know of 4 more families in this county who've been sitting on the same story for years waiting for someone to tell them it was worth telling. She couldn't speak for a moment. That's not enough for a federal case, she said when she found her voice. Not yet. He held up one hand. But combined with your father's journal, it might be enough to get a federal marshal's attention before the September circuit. Enough to open a review. Enough to make it very difficult for Silas Blackwood to quietly make this disappear. She thought of her father at his desk. 67 pages of patient, exact handwriting. Witnesses matter more. He knew, she said softly. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He was trying to build the network before... She stopped. Before they stopped him. Wyatt finished. Not gently. Not brutally. Simply. The way a man names a true thing without flinching from it. She nodded. He stepped past her toward the door and then paused with his hand on the frame, that same posture she was learning that meant he was going to say something that cost him something. I knew your father by reputation, he said. I knew him as a man who did the right thing when it would have been a great deal easier not to. He didn't turn around. I'd like to think that counts for something. She looked at his back. It counts, she said. He went inside. She stayed on the porch in the last of the light, pressing one hand flat against her sternum, where her father's journal sat tucked beneath her dress against her skin, the place she had started keeping it when the deputies had come. 67 pages, 2 days, and somewhere down the road, a widow was coming with letters that might at last begin to make this right. Abigail Turner breathed in the evening air, and for the first time in a very long time, she let herself believe it might be possible. She did not see the rider on the far ridge watching the house. She should have looked. Clara Sutter arrived before dawn. Abigail heard the horse first single rider, moving quiet and careful, the kind of pace that meant someone who didn't want to be seen. She was already dressed. She had not slept more than 2 hours. She came to the front door before Cleet could get there and opened it to find a woman in her late 40s, worn thin by years, and weather, with a canvas satchel pressed against her chest like she was holding a child. Clara looked at her for a long moment. You're Elias's daughter, she said. Not a question. You've got his eyes. Abigail felt something crack open in her chest without warning. She had not expected that. She had prepared for documents, for strategy, for the cold mechanics of evidence and timing. She had not prepared for someone looking at her face and seeing her father. Come in, she said, and her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. Clara came in. Wyatt was already at the table. Cleet closed the door behind them and took up a position near the window without being asked. Eli had been sent to the far pasture with instructions not to come back until noon. The less he knew, the safer he was, and they all understood that. Clara set the satchel on the table and opened it with the deliberate care of someone who had kept its contents safe for a long time and was not about to stop being careful now. 12 letters, she said. From your father between 1816 and 1818. He sent them through a dry goods merchant in Cooper County, man named Foster, who's been carrying discreet mail for people who don't trust the postal riders. Blackwoods bought 2 of those riders. Your father knew it. She spread the letters across the table, still in their envelopes. He was building a record outside the court system, something that couldn't be subpoenaed and buried. Abigail picked up the first envelope, her father's handwriting on the outside. The date, March 1816, 2 years before his death. She put it down. She would read them later when she wasn't in front of people. What do they say? Wyatt asked. The early ones are careful. Legal language, careful phrasing. He's documenting patterns he's noticed, asking Clara to record dates and details from her husband's case. Clara's voice was even the flatness of someone who has already done her grieving and is now in the business of doing something about it. The last three are different, more direct. He names Silas explicitly. He names Price. He says, and I can quote this because I've read it enough times I know it by heart. If something happens to me, these letters and the documentation I have compiled must reach federal hands. The circuit convenes in St. Louis in September of 1818. That is the deadline. After that, Blackwood will have cemented his claims through the county record system, and reversal becomes nearly impossible. The room was very quiet. He knew, Abigail said. He knew they were watching him, Clara said. He didn't know how close it was, or maybe he did and he just kept going anyway. She looked at Abigail steadily. He was that kind of man. Wyatt leaned forward. The families you mentioned, the Harpers, the Dodd brothers, the Wren widow, are they willing to make sworn statements? 2 of them. Yes, one I'm not certain about. Mira Wren is scared. She's got children. Blackwood's men came through her property twice this spring, and she doesn't know if it was a warning or a coincidence, and she can't afford to be wrong. Clara folded her hands on the table. But the Harpers are solid, and Tom Dodd's been looking for a reason to stand up for 3 years. You give him one and he'll stand. We need a federal marshal, Abigail said. Not a local man. Price has too many county connections. We need someone from outside the circuit who owes Blackwood nothing. There's a man, Wyatt said slowly. Marshal James Holt. Out of St. Louis. I crossed paths with him during the river campaign. Honest man, hard man, exactly the kind who doesn't enjoy being told what to do by people with money. He paused. Getting word to him is the problem. A letter through regular post is too slow and too visible. Someone would have to ride. I'll go, Clara said immediately. No, Wyatt said. They'll be watching the roads for Abigail, and anyone traveling with her or on her behalf is at risk. I won't send you into that. Then who? Me, Wyatt said. The word landed in the room and everything went still. Abigail looked at him. If you leave, Cleet can manage the ranch. He's done it before. He met her eyes. And if I'm the one who rides to St. Louis, Blackwood won't connect it to you. I've got legitimate business reasons to make that trip. Cattle contracts, nobody questions it. It's 4 days' ride, she said. Round trip is 8 days. The deputies will be back with a warrant in 2. Which is why you won't be here when they come. She stared at him. Clara's farm, he said. 40 miles north. Nobody knows you've had any contact with her. Blackwood's men are watching the roads south and east, the direction of Jefferson City, the direction you came from. They won't be watching north. He looked at Clara. Can you keep her safe for 8 days? I've kept those letters safe for 2 years, Clara said. I think I can manage a live person. Abigail opened her mouth, closed it. She had approximately 4 arguments lined up, and she could see looking at Wyatt's face that he had already considered and answered all of them. This puts you in front of Blackwood, she said. If Silas finds out you're carrying information to a federal marshal, then he'll have made a very significant mistake, Wyatt said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet and very final. Because I've been tolerating his land grabs and his bought sheriffs and his social maneuvering for 3 years, and I've been tolerating it because I didn't have anything solid enough to justify the fight. He looked at the letters spread across the table. Now I do. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about her father. Witnesses matter more. She had been looking for witnesses. She had not considered the possibility that one of them would walk up and volunteer. All right, she said. God, they moved her before daylight. It was Wyatt's idea to make it look like she had simply left a maid who'd gotten a better offer, or gotten scared, or just gone the way transient workers went, without notice and without drama. He had Cleet spread the word casually at the morning feed Alice Gray had packed up and moved on, good luck to her wherever she landed. Not remarkable. Not memorable. The kind of thing that happened every few weeks in ranch country. Abigail took the tin box and the journal and 2 changes of clothing and nothing else. She left before the hands were awake in the pre-dawn dark on a horse Wyatt had saddled himself without telling Eli or anyone else which direction she was headed. Wyatt walked her to the gate. She stopped there and turned to look at him because it felt wrong to leave without saying something real. And she had spent enough of the last weeks swallowing real things to be tired of it. "You don't owe me this," she said. "I know that," he said. "If Silas connects you to a federal investigation, pay Abigail." He said her name the way he said most things, without decoration, without excess, just the word placed down like a stone that intended to stay. "Your father spent 11 years building something true. The least I can do is make sure it gets to the right people." She had nothing to say to that, which was perhaps the point. 8 days, she said. 8 days. He agreed. He reached up and touched the brim of his hat, brief, formal, the gesture of a man who didn't know how to say goodbye any other way. Ride careful. She rode north. She did not look back. She had learned long ago that looking back while moving forward was how people fell off horses. But she thought about the gate behind her for the full first hour of the ride. Yig. Clara's farm was exactly as unremarkable as safety required a working homestead, the kind that blended into the Missouri landscape because there were thousands just like it, all of them making the same small daily decisions about corn and water and winter prep that kept a family alive year to year. Clara showed her the room, showed her where the food was kept, pointed out the root cellar in case anyone came who shouldn't, and then left her to rest with the simple efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped wasting words on things that didn't need them. Abigail sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened her father's journal to the last page and read the final entry one more time. Then she read the 12 letters. All of them, beginning to end. By the time she finished the last one, it was mid-morning, and she was sitting on the floor with her back against the bed frame and her face in her hands. Not crying, she had moved past crying some weeks ago into a place that was harder and quieter, but simply holding the full weight of who her father had been. How clearly he had seen what was coming. How carefully he had worked to make sure that even if it reached him, it would not stop there. He had planned for her. He had planned for this, for exactly this moment, for the letters to reach exactly these hands at exactly this point in the arc of what he had set in motion. She had not been a coincidence. She had been his plan. She pressed the last letter against her chest. "I'm going to finish it," she said to the empty room. To him. "I'm going to finish what you started." The room didn't answer. It didn't need to. 5 days and Tom Dodd rode to Clara's farm with news that turned Abigail's blood cold. Wyatt had not reached St. Louis. Dodd had a friend who worked the river ferry at the Missouri crossing, and that friend had sent word through the same dry goods channel Clara used. Wyatt had been stopped 2 days out by what looked like Blackwood's private riders. 4 men. They had spoken to him on the road, searched his saddlebags, and eventually let him pass when they found nothing, because Wyatt had been smart enough to carry the letters inside his coat rather than in his bags. But he had lost half a day, and the riders were still on the road behind him. "He got through," Dodd said. "My friend saw him cross the river, but those men didn't go home. They're riding parallel to him." Abigail looked at Clara. "They're not trying to stop him," Clara said slowly. "They're following him, trying to see who he contacts, which means they suspect what he's doing but don't have confirmation." Abigail's mind was running fast and flat, the way it did when fear tried to take over and she refused to let it. If Wyatt reaches Holt and they see him do it, they'll move, not through legal channels, directly. "How do you mean?" Dodd said. She looked at him. "I mean, they'll try to make sure neither Wyatt nor the marshal makes it back to Red Creek." The silence that followed had teeth. "Then we can't wait for Wyatt to come back," Clara said. "No," Abigail agreed. "We can't." What she did next was the thing her father had taught her never to do. She made herself visible. Not recklessly, she was not her father's daughter for nothing. She thought it through for 2 hours, and then she explained it to Clara. And then she rode back toward Red Creek in the early afternoon of the 6th day, with her head up, and the journal in her coat, and the 12 letters in the satchel at her hip. She was done hiding. Silas Blackwood wanted her found. Fine. She would be found. She would walk into the middle of Red Creek at 2 in the afternoon with every piece of evidence she had, and she would make it impossible for anyone in that town to pretend they hadn't seen her, because once enough people had seen her, Silas could no longer make her disappear quietly. This was her father's principle applied in reverse. Witnesses matter more. Well, she was going to make herself a witness too. She rode past the first houses of Red Creek with her back straight, and her hands steady and a cold, calm, absolute clarity in her chest, that she recognized with some distant part of her mind as the absence of fear. Not because she wasn't afraid, but because she had stopped letting it drive. The first person who recognized her was Henderson from the dry goods store. He stopped dead on the boardwalk and stared. She nodded to him. Kept riding. By the time she reached the center of town, there were at least a dozen people watching. She could feel their attention like weather-uncertain building, waiting to see which direction it would break. She pulled up in front of the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a barrel-chested man named Croft, who had been in Blackwood's pocket for as long as Abigail had been in Red Creek, came out onto the steps and looked at her with an expression that mixed shocked calculation and something she was almost certain was fear. "Miss Turner," he said. "Sheriff Croft," she said. "I'm here to make a statement." He looked at the growing crowd behind her, looked back at her. The calculation in his face was loud enough to read from horseback. "You're wanted for questioning in connection with—" "I know what I'm wanted for," she said. "Silas Blackwood fabricated a theft charge to discredit a witness in a federal land fraud investigation. You know that, and I know that, and I suspect most of the people behind me know it too, even if they haven't said so out loud." She reached into her satchel and produced a sealed document, one of the letters specific and damning, the one her father had written naming Price and Blackwood, and dated 14 months before his death. She held it up where the crowd could see. "My father was a federal judge. He was murdered. I have documented evidence of land fraud affecting a minimum of 43 families in this county. And as of 3 days ago, a United States federal marshal is in possession of copies of that documentation." That last part was not precisely true, but Wyatt was in St. Louis, and she needed Silas's men to believe he had already delivered. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. Sheriff Croft stood on the steps with his mouth slightly open and the expression of a man watching the ground move under his feet. Then she heard Victoria Blackwood's voice cut through the crowd from her left, and everything sharpened. "This woman is a thief and a liar." Victoria had come out of the establishment across the street, moving fast, dressed as immaculately as always, with 2 of Silas's men half a step behind her. Her voice was carrying and cold and pitched perfectly for an audience. Her father stole documents from private clients, and she continued his criminal enterprise. Whatever she's holding is fabricated evidence she created herself to escape a legitimate warrant. The crowd shifted. Abigail could feel it. The uncertainty, the social pressure of Victoria's confidence, the deep human pull toward believing whoever spoke loudest. She was not her father's daughter, for nothing. "If these documents are fabricated," Abigail said, loud and clear and steady, "then Silas Blackwood has nothing to fear from a federal review." She turned in her saddle so the full crowd could see her face. "Is that his position? He welcomes a federal investigation." Victoria's eyes went hard. "The only investigation needed is into your criminal—" "I'm asking a simple question." Abigail's voice didn't waver. "Does Silas Blackwood welcome a federal review of his land registrations, yes or no?" Another silence, different quality. The kind that meant something was shifting. And then a voice from the back of the crowd ruffled, or the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose, and maybe knew it. "My deed," the voice said. "He took my deed. 40 acres my daddy broke from scratch. I got a copy of the original registration, same parcel number as the one Blackwood claims now. I've been carrying it for 2 years, waiting for somebody to care. Another voice. A woman this time. My husband signed something he didn't understand. Blackwood's lawyer told him it was a tax document. Then another. Then 2 more at once. Victoria's face had gone still. The 2 men behind her had gone still. And Abigail sat her horse in the center of Red Creek, with her father's letter held in her hand, and felt something she had not felt since the night she ran from Jefferson City, with blood on her hands and terror in her chest. She felt it turning. Then the doors of the sheriff's office opened behind Croft, and the man who stepped out was not a deputy. He was tall, dusty from hard riding, with a federal marshal's badge on his coat, and the particular bearing of a man who had arrived precisely when he intended to. Behind him, a step behind, and slightly limping from what looked like a hard 2 days on the road, was Wyatt Callahan. He met her eyes across the crowd. She felt her chest crack open the same way it had when Clara said, "You've got his eyes," that sudden interior collapse of something that had been held rigid for too long. He had made it. He had made it, and he had brought help, and he was here. Victoria took one look at the marshal's badge, and the crowd behind Abigail, and the letters in her hand, and for the first time since Abigail had laid eyes on her, Victoria Blackwood looked uncertain. Just for a moment. Then her face smoothed back into its habitual composure, and she said very quietly to the men beside her, "Go find Silas, now." But it was already too late for that. Marshal Holt stepped forward, placed himself between Victoria's men and Abigail's horse, and said in the flat, carrying voice of a man who had done this before and did not expect to have to do it twice, "My name is James Holt, United States Marshal, Western District. I am here in response to documentation submitted to my office 3 days ago, alleging federal land fraud under the authority of the Territorial Land Registration Act of 1804. He looked directly at Sheriff Croft. "I am going to need your office, your records, and your cooperation, in that order." Croft looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at the crowd. The crowd looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Wyatt. He was watching her with that unreadable expression of his, the one she had spent weeks learning to read. The one that looked like nothing until you understood that for Wyatt Callahan, nothing was where all the important things lived. She got down off the horse. Her legs were shaking slightly from the ride. She ignored them. She walked through the crowd, which parted slowly, then more quickly, until she was standing in front of him. "You made it," she said. "Told you 8 days," he said. "It's been 6. "Rode fast," he said, and then so quiet that only she could hear it. "You all right?" She thought about that. About what the last 6 days had been. About her father's letters and Clara's farm, and riding into Red Creek alone with her chin up, and the full weight of everything she had been carrying for 2 months, pressing down on her chest. "I will be," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded document, official, sealed, bearing the Federal Circuit stamp. "Holt brought a writ," he said. "Freezes all Blackwood land transfers pending review. Effective immediately. That means every family he's robbed in this county keeps their land while the case is built." He held it out to her. "Your father's journal is on record with the federal court in St. Louis. His name is on the documentation as the originating investigator." She took the document, held it, her father's name, on a federal record, in connection with a case that was now too big and too official and too witnessed for anyone to make disappear. She pressed the paper flat against her chest, the same way she pressed his journal, and she breathed. Around them, the town of Red Creek was loud and churning and unresolved. Victoria's voice rising somewhere behind her. Croft's deputies visible at the edges of the crowd, the voices of farmers and settlers and witnesses overlapping and urgent. There was still a fight ahead. Silas was still out there. This was not over. But something had broken open that could not be sealed again. Abigail Turner stood in the center of Red Creek with a federal writ in her hands. Her father's work finally breathing in the open air, and Wyatt Callahan 3 feet away, solid and present and not going anywhere. She had ridden into this town like a hunted woman. She was not leaving it the same way. The writ meant nothing to Silas Blackwood. That was the first thing Abigail understood in the hours that followed as Marshal Holt settled into Sheriff Croft's office and began the slow, methodical work of a federal investigation. And as the crowd in the street gradually dispersed into smaller knots of people who stood close together and spoke low and watched the doors of the sheriff's office like they expected something to come through them. Silas arrived in Red Creek before sundown. He came with 6 men, and he came unhurried, which was worse than if he'd come angry. Angry men made mistakes. Unhurried men had already calculated the cost and decided they could pay it. Abigail was inside the sheriff's office when she heard the horses. Wyatt was beside her. Holt was at Croft's desk, working through the land registry documents Abigail had laid out in front of him. Her father's journal opened the 12 letters from Clara, arranged by date, a map of the county with 43 parcels marked in her father's hand. Holt looked up when the horses stopped outside. He did not stand. He simply reached across the desk and moved his coat slightly so the badge on his chest was unobstructed, and then he went back to reading. Abigail had the sudden understanding that James Holt had done this exact thing before in exactly this kind of town, and that he was not impressed by 6 men on horseback. Silas came through the door alone. He was not what she had expected. She had built him in her mind over 2 years into something enormous, a force, a shadow, the shape of everything her father had fought against. The real Silas Blackwood was a man of perhaps 50 trim and well-dressed, with the composed, pleasant face of someone who had long since learned that pleasantness was the most effective disguise available. He looked at Holt first, then at Abigail. Something moved in his eyes when he saw her quick, controlled, and gone before most people would have caught it. She caught it. It looked a great deal like the recalculation of a plan that had just encountered an unexpected variable. "Marshal Holt," Silas said pleasantly. "I wasn't aware the Federal Circuit had business in Red Creek." "It does now," Holt said without looking up. "I see." Silas moved his gaze to Wyatt. "Callahan, I'm surprised to see you involved in this." "Are you?" Wyatt said. "I am. You've always struck me as a practical man." A pause calibrated. Practical men don't usually put themselves in the middle of other people's legal troubles. "I reckon it depends," Wyatt said, "on whether the legal trouble is real or manufactured." Silas smiled. It was an excellent smile, the smile of a man who had practiced it until it contained exactly nothing. "Everything my land trust has done is on record and fully legal under territorial law." "Then you have nothing to worry about from a federal review," Abigail said. Silas turned to her fully for the first time. He looked at her the way he had looked at Holt, assessing, precise, utterly composed. She made herself hold the gaze without blinking. She was her father's daughter. She knew how to be looked at by men who thought looking was a form of power. "Miss Turner," he said, "you've been through a great deal. I understand that. Your father's death was a tragedy. He was a capable man, and I have nothing but respect for his memory." The words were so perfectly arranged, they almost sounded true. But grief can lead people to conclusions that aren't supported by fact. If you believe you have documentation of wrongdoing, the appropriate course. The documentation is in federal hands. Holt said, still not looking up. The appropriate course has been taken. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Silas stood very still for a moment. The pleasantness stayed on his face through what was clearly considerable effort. I'll want to speak with my attorney, he said. You're welcome to do that, Holt said. I'd recommend it. Silas left. The door closed behind him. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Then Holt set down his pen, leaned back in the chair, and looked at Abigail with the measuring expression of a man recalibrating his estimate of someone. He'll move tonight, Holt said. I know, she said. He won't come at the documentation directly. It's in federal record now, he knows that. He'll go after witnesses. Holt picked up the pen again. Who else in this county has information that isn't already in this room? Clara Sutter, Wyatt said. Tom Dodd. Possibly Mira Wren. Get them here, Holt said. Tonight. If Blackwood gets to them before they make sworn statements, the case gets complicated. Wyatt was already moving. It was Cleet who rode to Clara's farm because Cleet was the kind of man whose presence on a road at dusk attracted no particular attention. It was Tom Dodd who rode for Mira Wren because he was her neighbor, and she trusted him in the particular way that frightened people trust the one person who hasn't run yet. Abigail stayed in the sheriff's office and worked. She had not done this in months. Sat at a proper desk with proper documents and organized a legal case the way her father had taught her, the way she had watched him do it 100 times. Growing up, the slow, careful assembly of evidence into argument into record. Her hands knew the work. Her mind knew the work. She had been pretending to know nothing for so long that using what she actually knew felt strange at first, and then felt like taking off a coat that had never quite fit. Holt worked beside her without comment. He was a precise, economical man, asked exactly the questions he needed answered, read exactly what he needed to read, made no remarks that weren't useful. Abigail respected that the way she respected most things that resembled her father's habits. At some point, Wyatt came back and stood in the doorway and said, "Cleet's got Clara. Dodd got to Mira Wren before Blackwood's man did. They're both coming." Abigail did not look up from the document in front of her. "How close was Blackwood's man?" "Close enough," Wyatt said. "Dodd said the rider was at the end of Mira's road when he was coming out her front door. Another 20 minutes and it would have been different." She felt the edge of that narrowness and let herself feel it for exactly 1 second, and then she set it aside and kept writing. "Good," she said. "That's good." Holt looked at her. She had the sense he was filing something away about her the way he filed everything quietly, permanently, without comment. Clara arrived at 9. Mira Wren arrived at 10, white-faced and shaking with Tom Dodd's solid presence behind her, like a wall between her and the dark outside. Mira sat down across from Abigail and folded her hands on the table and said without preamble, "If I do, this are my children safe?" Abigail looked at her. At the specific quality of her fear, not weakness, but the fear of a woman who had already survived hard things and understood exactly what the cost of being wrong would be. "I won't lie to you," Abigail said. "Tonight is uncertain. What I can tell you is that a federal marshal has your name in his records now, which means if anything happens to you after you make a sworn statement, it becomes a federal matter. That's not perfect protection, but it's real." Mira looked at Holt. Holt nodded once. Mira's hands tightened on the table. Then she said, "All right. What do you need to know?" She talked for 45 minutes. Abigail wrote. Holt wrote. Tom Dodd sat beside Mira, with his big calloused hands on his knees, and did not say a single word the entire time, because the most useful thing he could do in that moment was be there, and he understood that. When Mira finished, she was crying silently. Not dramatically, just the quiet leaking tears of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. "He told my husband it was a tax form," she said. "He said it was just a tax form. My husband couldn't read not well. He trusted people." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. "He died thinking he'd lost the land because of something he'd done wrong. 3 years I've watched my children grow up thinking their father failed them." Abigail set down her pen. "He didn't fail them," she said. "He was robbed. And now there's a federal record that says so." Mira looked at her, a long, searching look. "Your father," she said. "He came to see us, you know, in 1816. He sat at our table and ate supper, and he listened to the whole story, and he wrote it down in that little book of his. He told me he said, 'Mrs. Wren, I cannot promise you justice today, but I can promise you that what happened to your family will not be forgotten.'" She looked down. "I thought that was something people just said." Abigail's throat was tight. "He meant it," she said. "Every word of it." The first threat came at midnight. One of Holt's deputies, he had brought 2 with him from St. Louis, quiet men who moved like people who had decided most things in advance, came in from outside to report that Silas's 6 men had not gone far. They were in the street, not doing anything, just present, which was its own kind of message. "He's waiting to see who leaves the building," Wyatt said. He was standing near the window, not looking out directly. if Clara or Mira tries to go home tonight?" "Nobody goes home tonight," Holt said. "Everyone stays here until morning. My deputies will keep watch." Clara took this without complaint. Mira looked scared, but nodded. Tom Dodd cracked his knuckles and said he'd been wanting a reason to stay in town overnight anyway, which made nobody smile, but somehow made the room feel slightly less like a trap. Wyatt stayed too. He positioned himself near the door in the way he positioned himself near all important thresholds, not dramatically, not making a show of it, just placing himself where he needed to be with the calm certainty of someone who had decided. Abigail watched him and thought about how she had arrived on his porch 40 miles from anywhere running hard and carrying everything she owned in a tin box, and he had simply stepped aside and let her in. No questions about what she deserved, no calculation of what it would cost him. Just step aside. Come in. She had not understood then what kind of man did that. She was beginning to understand now. The second threat came at 3 in the morning, and it was worse. Sheriff Croft knocked on the door of his own office, which was strange enough that everybody in the room went still, and when Holt opened it, Croft came in with the look of a man who had spent several hours deciding something, and didn't much like the decision he'd arrived at. He was carrying a document. He set it on the desk in front of Holt. "Blackwood's attorney filed this an hour ago with the county court," Croft said. He had the flat voice of a man trying not to sound ashamed of himself and not quite managing it. "Emergency injunction. Claims the documents in your possession were obtained through theft and cannot be used as federal evidence pending a county court review of their provenance." Holt picked up the document. "Read it. Set it back down." "County court has no jurisdiction over federal evidence," he said. "I know that," Croft said. "Then what is this?" Croft looked at the floor, then at Abigail. Something shifted in his face that she hadn't seen there before. Not guilt exactly, but the first faint recognition that guilt was coming for him, and he couldn't outrun it. "It's a delay," Croft said. "He wants you tied up in jurisdictional argument long enough to manage the situation otherwise." "Manage," Wyatt said. His voice had gone very quiet. "What does manage mean, Croft?" Croft's jaw tightened. "I'm not part of what he's planning. I want you to know that." He looked at Holt. "I've been in Blackwood's pocket for 3 years. I'm not proud of it. But I'm not. I won't be part of what he's planning for tonight." The room was absolutely still. "What is he planning?" Abigail said. Croft looked at her. Something in his face said he hadn't expected to be speaking directly to her, and that the experience of it was harder than he'd anticipated. "He knows the case is built," Croft said. "He knows the federal record exists and he can't make it disappear, so he's going to try to make the witnesses disappear instead." A pause. He's not going to kill anyone. He's smarter than that with a marshal in town. But he's got 2 men who are going to try to get Clara Sutter and Mira Wren to recant. Tonight, before morning. "Get to them how?" Holt said. "They're in this building." Croft didn't answer. Abigail looked at the window. At the door. At the walls of the sheriff's office that she had been thinking of as a safe place. "There's a back way in," she said. "Not a question." Croft looked at the floor again. That was answer enough. Wyatt moved before anyone else did through the inner door toward the back of the building, his hand already on the rifle he'd been carrying since they'd arrived. Holt's 2 deputies were right behind him. Holt himself stayed with the women, which was the right call. He was the federal authority, and his presence in the room was the thing that made Clara and Mira's testimony legally real. Abigail stood up. "Stay here," Holt said to her. "No," she said, and followed Wyatt. There were 2 of them in the back corridor. They had come in through the storage room. The lock had been broken efficiently and quietly by someone who had done it before or been told exactly how. They had not expected Wyatt to be 3 steps inside the door when they came through it. What followed was not elegant. It was not the kind of confrontation that looked like anything from the outside. It was 2 men who had expected to intimidate unarmed women in the dark, and Wyatt Callahan's considerable ability to fill a doorway and not move, and Holt's deputies arriving 30 seconds later to formalize what Wyatt had already made clear. Nobody fired a shot. Nobody needed to. When the two men were outside with Holt's deputies, and the immediate crisis had collapsed into the flat adrenaline aftermath that always felt smaller than the fear that preceded it, Abigail leaned against the corridor wall and let herself breathe. Wyatt was beside her. He was breathing harder than usual, not from exertion. "You all right?" she said. "Asked you that already," he said. "Seems like it's your turn to ask." "I'm asking." He looked at her in the dark of the corridor, and she could not read his face clearly, but she could hear something in his breathing that she recognized because she had been carrying the same thing for 2 months. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding a great deal of tension for a great deal of time and is only now being given permission to feel the weight of it. "I'm fine," he said. She didn't believe him. She also understood that pressing him on it right now would be the wrong thing to do, and that there would be time later when this was over, and they were both not running on adrenaline, and the law's need for witnesses to ask him things that deserved actual answers. "Let's go back," she said. He nodded. They went back. The morning broke slow and gray, and the men Silas had left in the street were gone. Not because Silas had given up. He had simply recognized that the direct approach had failed and had fallen back to the only remaining strategy available to him, the legal one. Which meant a county court fight over jurisdiction, which meant delay, which meant months of argument while the federal case was built around the edges. He thought delay would help him. He had not fully considered who he was delaying against. Abigail spent the morning of that second day in Red Creek, sitting across from Holt at the desk with the full documentation spread between them, and she walked him through it the way her father had taught her to walk through a legal argument, beginning to end every link in the chain, every piece of evidence connected to the next, no gaps and no assumptions. When she finished, Holt sat back in the chair and looked at her for a long moment. "You're not a lawyer," he said. "My father was," she said. "You might want to consider it." He said it matter-of-factly the way he said everything. "The territorial bar is open to application in St. Louis, with documentation of your father's training and an examination before the circuit. One crisis at a time," she said. He almost smiled. It was a small movement and gone quickly, but she caught it. She filed it away. "The county court injunction won't hold," Holt said. "Federal statute is unambiguous on evidentiary jurisdiction, but it will take 2 to 3 weeks to resolve, and during that time, Blackwood will be working every connection he has in Jefferson City to slow the federal review." He looked at the map with her father's 43 parcels. "I need more than documentation. I need public record." She understood him immediately. "You need the testimony public," she said. "Not just in your records, publicly stated before witnesses in a venue where it can't be quietly filed away." "Town meeting," Wyatt said from behind her. She turned. He was in the doorway. She was learning that doorways were where he did his best thinking. "Red Creek has a public meeting structure," he said. "Monthly assembly last Friday of the month. This Friday. Any citizen can bring a matter before the assembled town." He looked at Holt. "You present your federal writ. I bring the families who lost land. Abigail presents her father's documentation publicly." He paused. "You get it on the public record and in front of enough witnesses that it can't be managed away." Holt looked at Abigail. "It also puts you directly in front of Blackwood in a public forum," Holt said to her, "with no federal protection other than my badge and whatever the crowd decides to do with what they hear." "I know," she said. "Blackwood will be there." "Good," she said. "He should hear it himself." Holt considered her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Friday," he said. The days between felt simultaneously too long and too short. Abigail spent them at the ranch Wyatt had brought her back, when it became clear that the immediate danger had shifted to the legal arena, where Blackwood's men had no particular use helping Clara and Mira prepare their statements. Not softening them. The opposite. Sharpening them. Holt had given her guidance on what constituted legally admissible testimony versus emotional account. and she worked with both women to distinguish between what they knew and what they felt. Because in a public forum, both mattered, but in different ways. Clara was steady. She had been steady since the beginning. Mira was harder. Not because she wasn't brave, she was considerably, but because every time she spoke about her husband's face, the day he understood what he had signed, she had to stop. And stopping was something she couldn't afford at a town assembly with Silas Blackwood in the front row. On the second evening, Abigail sat with her at Clara's kitchen table and said without preamble, "What would your husband want you to do?" Mira's hands went still. "He'd want me to burn Silas Blackwood's operation to the ground," she said. Figuratively. "Then that's what we're going to do," Abigail said. Figuratively. Something changed in Mira's face, hardened into something clean and determined. She squared her shoulders, picked up her written statement and said, "Read it back to me. I want it perfect." They worked until midnight. On Thursday evening, the night before the assembly, Wyatt found Abigail on the back porch of the ranch house where he had found her on so many evenings before the porch, where things got said that couldn't quite be said indoors, because the dark and the open air allowed for a kind of honesty that walls made difficult. He sat down beside her. Not close, far enough, the way he always did, They were quiet for a while. The kind of quiet that had stopped feeling uncomfortable weeks ago, and had become something she recognized as its own form of communication, two people who didn't need to fill space because the space itself was comfortable. "After tomorrow," he said finally. She looked at him. "After tomorrow," he said, "and after the federal case is underway, and Blackwood's in custody, and the families have their land back." He stopped, started again. "I want to know what you want." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to finish what my father started," she said. "The case, the documentation, all 43 families. I want to see every single one of those land transfers reversed. That could take years." "I know." And after that, she looked out at the dark. She thought about Jefferson City, about her father's house, which was Blackwood's now on paper, but not in any way that would survive a federal review. She thought about Holt's comment about the territorial bar, which she had not stopped thinking about despite telling herself she was thinking about other things. She thought about Wyatt. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. He nodded. He seemed to have expected that answer. "That's fair," he said. They were quiet again. Then he said, still not looking at her, "Whatever you decide, wherever that takes you, you should know that this ranch is big enough that it doesn't need to be the end of anything. If a person wanted to use it as a place to work from, or come back to." She looked at his profile, at the set of his jaw, at the precise, deliberate way he was not looking at her, which she was learning meant the same thing for Wyatt Callahan that direct eye contact meant for most people. "Is that an offer?" she said. "It's an observation," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. Barely. Enough. She faced forward again. The dark was full and soft and smelled like summer grass. "It's a good observation," she said quietly. He didn't respond. But she felt the small shift in him, the infinitesimal relaxation of someone who has said the thing they needed to say and found to their considerable relief that the world had not ended. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow there would be a town assembly, and Silas Blackwood in the front row, and everything her father had built toward finally spoken aloud in the open air. But tonight was tonight, and tonight was enough. She sat beside Wyatt Callahan in the last of the summer warmth and let herself have it. Friday came in hard and bright, the kind of summer morning that felt like a dare. Abigail was dressed before dawn. She sat at the edge of her bed in the quiet and held her father's journal one last time, not reading it, just holding it, the leather worn soft at the corners from 2 months of being carried against her body. She had memorized every page. She no longer needed to read it, but she needed to hold it the same way she sometimes needed to hear her own breathing just to confirm she was still in the fight. She put it in her coat pocket close to her chest and went downstairs. Wyatt was already at the table with coffee and the particular stillness of a man who had been awake for some time and had used the time to settle something inside himself. He looked up when she came in. He did not say good morning. He said, "You ready?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, poured her coffee without being asked. They drank in silence, and it was the most fortifying silence she had experienced in 2 months. The town assembly met in the largest building. Red Creek had a wide-floored hall that served as church on Sundays, courthouse on occasion, and community meeting space whenever something needed to be said in front of enough witnesses to make it real. By 9 in the morning, it was full. Word had moved through the county the way word always moved in small places, faster than any writer, more accurate than any newspaper, carried on the specific electricity of people who understood that something important was about to happen and didn't want to miss it. Clara Sutter was already inside when Abigail arrived, seated in the second row with her hands folded and her canvas satchel on her lap, and the unshakable composure of a woman who had waited 3 years for this morning and was not going to waste it on nerves. Tom Dodd was 2 seats down, broad and solid. Mira Wren was beside Clara, pale, but present, her hands wrapped around each other in her lap like she was keeping them from shaking by sheer force of will. Abigail caught Mira's eyes as she came in. Mira gave her a small nod. "I'm here. I'm ready." Abigail nodded back. "That's enough." Holt was at the front of the room, standing to one side, with the particular stillness of a federal man in a county space, present, without being threatening, authoritative, without being loud. His 2 deputies were at the doors. The arrangement was deliberate. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. Silas Blackwood was in the front row. He had come, which she had expected. He had come alone, which surprised her, and then she understood. He had come without his men, because arriving with muscle would signal that he felt threatened, and Silas Blackwood had survived this long by never letting anyone see him feel threatened. He sat with his hat in his lap and his face composed and pleasant, and gave absolutely nothing away. Victoria was not there. Abigail noted the absence and filed it. Sheriff Croft sat along the side wall, not with Blackwood, not with Holt. In between. Which was, she supposed, the most honest position Croft had taken in years. Wyatt sat beside Abigail in the 3rd row. She felt him there the way she felt solid ground, not consciously, just as a baseline fact that made everything else navigable. Alderman Peters called the assembly to order. He was a careful, cautious man who had clearly spent the last 2 days deciding how to handle this, and had arrived at the only position available to a man who wanted to sleep at night. He would run the meeting according to procedure, and let the procedure do what it was built to do. "We have a federal matter brought before this assembly," he said. "Marshal Holt of the Western District has requested time to address the community regarding an ongoing federal investigation. He has that time." He looked around the room. "After that, any citizen with relevant information may speak. We will conduct ourselves with order." Holt stepped forward. He spoke for 12 minutes. He was not theatrical about it. He stated facts: the federal land registration statutes, the documentation submitted to his office, the writ of review currently in effect, the specific legal mechanisms by which fraudulent territorial land transfers would be addressed. He named no names in those 12 minutes. He simply laid out the architecture of the law clearly and without embellishment, the way a man lays out tools before beginning work. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Then Silas Blackwood said pleasantly from the front row, "Thank you, Marshal. I think we all appreciate the federal government's diligence. I want to assure this community that my land trust welcomes any review, and I am confident that—" "Mr. Blackwood," Peters said, "you'll have an opportunity to speak. This is not that moment." Silas settled back. The pleasantness didn't flicker, but his right hand, Abigail noted, had tightened slightly on the brim of the hat in his lap. Peters looked at Abigail. "Miss Turner," he said, "you've requested time to present documentation. You have it." She stood up. The room did not go silent. It had been mostly silent, but it went still, which was different. The specific stillness of a large group of people who are all paying the same quality of attention. She walked to the front. She turned around to face them. She had prepared this. She had practiced it in her head every day for the past 4 days. But standing in front of this room in this town with her father's journal in her coat and 43 families worth of stolen land behind everything she was about to say, the preparation fell away. And what replaced it was something cleaner and older and entirely her own. She spoke for her father. She told the truth. "My name is Abigail Turner," she said. "My father was Federal Judge Elias Turner, appointed to the Missouri Circuit in 1807. He served this territory for 11 years, and he was murdered in the spring of 1818 because of what I'm about to show you." She heard the intake of breath move through the room like wind. She opened the journal. She did not read all of it. She read the relevant sections, specific, precise, dated. Certificate numbers, parcel boundaries, the names of county clerks who had accepted payment to falsify registrations, the name of Judge Price appearing on documents no sitting federal judge should have touched. 43 families, 11 years, one systematic patient, carefully constructed theft. She read for 22 minutes. Nobody moved. When she finished, she set the journal on the table beside Holt's documents and said, "My father built this record because he believed that documentation endures. He believed that truth properly recorded and properly witnessed cannot be permanently suppressed." She looked at the room. He was right. It just took longer than he lived to see. Then Clara stood up. She read from 3 of the letters, the ones her father had written in 1817, when he knew they were watching him, when his handwriting had started to shake, but his words had not. She read them in her steady, unshowy voice, and when she was done, she held them up and said, "These are originals. I have kept them for 2 years. I will give them to Marshal Holt today." Then Tom Dodd stood up. He didn't have letters. He had his own memory, which he delivered with the blunt directness of a man who had never learned to soften things, and had stopped believing softness was useful. "They took my 40 acres, he said. "My wife and I broke that ground together. She's buried on it. I signed something I thought was a tax form because a man in a fine coat told me it was, and I couldn't read the small print. That land is mine. It was always mine. And I want it back." He sat down. Then Mira Wren stood up. She was shaking. Abigail could see it from across the room. The fine tremor in her hands, the effort it cost her to stand and face a room full of people with Silas Blackwood in the front row. She looked at her written statement. Then she set it on the seat beside her. She didn't read from it. She just spoke. "My husband's name was George Wren," she said. "He was a good man. He worked that land for 6 years. He thought he'd done something wrong, some mistake with paperwork, something he didn't understand, and he carried that shame until he died." Her voice broke once clean and controlled, and then came back. "He didn't do anything wrong. He was cheated by a man who knew he couldn't read and used it against him." She looked directly at Silas. "George Wren was worth 10 of you. And his children are going to know that. Starting today." The room had stopped breathing. Silas had not moved. His face was still composed, still pleasant, but the hat brim in his hands was crushed now, the felt distorted where his fingers had been pressing for 20 minutes. 6 more people stood up. Abigail had not expected 6 more. She had expected the people she knew about. But they came one at a time, a farmer from the north end of the county, a widow whose husband had served in the same campaign as Wyatt, a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, and whose family had lost their land before he was old enough to understand what that meant. They stood up and they said their names and they said what had been taken from them, and with each one the room changed, not louder, but denser, the way a storm gets dense before it breaks. Silas stood up after the 6th one. "This is an organized slander campaign," he said. His voice was still controlled, almost. "These people are making unverified claims based on fabricated documentation created by a woman who has been actively evading a lawful warrant, Mr. Blackwood." Holt's voice was not loud. It had the quality of something that didn't need to be loud. "Sit down. I have the right to speak in this assembly. You have the right to speak to your attorney," Holt said. I am formally notifying you that you are under federal investigation for land fraud under the Territorial Land Registration Act of 1804, conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, and related charges. You are not under arrest at this moment, but I would strongly advise you to stop speaking in a public forum. He paused. Sit down. Silas looked at him, at the room, at the 9 families now sitting or standing with their names on the federal record. He sat down. The composure was still there. But it had cracks in it now. Fine lines like a glazed surface that has been struck and held together through habit rather than integrity. The meeting broke up slowly, the way these things do when the main event has concluded, but everyone needs time to absorb what they just witnessed. People moved in small clusters, voices low and urgent. Abigail stood near the front of the room and answered questions from Peters, from 2 of the families she hadn't known about, from a woman who grabbed her hand with both of hers and said only, "Your father came to our door once. I never forgot it," and then walked away before Abigail could answer. She didn't need to answer. She was watching Silas. He had not left. He stood near the front door with his ruined hat in his hands and his face doing something she had not seen it do before working. Not the smooth, controlled processing of a man who has planned for everything. The genuine, visible labor of a man discovering that he has not planned for this. Holt approached him with one deputy at his shoulder and spoke to him quietly, too low for Abigail to hear. She watched Silas's face as Holt spoke. She watched the moment he understood that the federal writ was real, that the evidence was in federal record, that the county court injunction had already been overruled by telegraph from the circuit court that morning. Holt had received the message at 7 and had not mentioned it until now, which was a marshal's version of saving the finishing stroke. Silas looked up and across the room, and his eyes found Abigail's. She did not look away. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he did something she had not expected. He gave a small nod, not apology, not concession, not quite acknowledgement, something older and more involuntary than any of those things. The nod of a man who recognizes that he has met something he cannot maneuver around. Then he looked away, and the fight went out of him so visibly and completely that it looked like a physical thing leaving a body. Holt's deputy moved to his shoulder. He went without resistance. Abigail stood in the emptying room and breathed. She waited for the feeling she had imagined this moment would carry, the surge of triumph, the bright, clean relief of a thing finally finished. It came, but not the way she had expected. It was quieter, heavier. It felt less like winning, and more like being allowed at last to stop running. Like her body understood before her mind did that the particular effort she had been making for 2 months, the effort of surviving toward a goal while pretending the goal was the only thing that mattered, could finally be set down. Her father had spent 11 years building toward this. She had spent 2 months completing it. It was not enough. It would never feel like enough, because the thing it had cost was not a thing you got back. But it was true. It was in the federal record. It was witnessed and real, and it could not be unmade. That would have to be enough. And somehow standing there, she found that it was. She felt Wyatt before she saw him, the specific quality of his presence, which she had learned over weeks to recognize the way you learn to recognize a voice in another room. He moved to stand beside her in the emptying hall. They looked at the room together. "Your father would have been proud," he said. She had been holding herself together all morning through the cold mechanics of purpose. This, said plainly without decoration, nearly undid her. She felt the press of tears at the back of her eyes, and refused them by the same mechanism she had been refusing them for 2 months, not suppression, just postponement. Later. There would be time later. "He would have wanted to see it himself," she said. "Yes," Wyatt said. "He would have." Nothing else needed to be said about that. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Abigail's life, not because they were hard, though some of them were, but because they were the first weeks in 2 years that were not organized entirely around survival or concealment. She had forgotten what it felt like to simply be somewhere doing work that mattered, Without the constant low-level pressure of threat against the back of her neck, the federal case moved through its machinery. Holt was thorough and methodical, and the Blackwood Land Trust unraveled under examination with the specific inevitability of structures built on falsification. Once you pulled the right thread, the whole thing came apart because false foundations cannot hold weight indefinitely. The forged certificates were identified. The 2 county clerks gave testimony. Judge Price resigned his seat before formal charges reached him, which everyone understood was not innocence, but calculation. Silas was indicted in September, the month her father had marked in his final letter as the deadline. The Federal Circuit Court convened. The evidence her father had spent 11 years building was entered into the record. Every land transfer conducted through fraudulent registration was flagged for reversal. 43 families. One by one their land came back. Tom Dodd got his 40 acres and stood in the middle of it for the better part of an afternoon without speaking. And everyone who saw him understood this was not a man who had nothing to say, but a man for whom some things had no adequate language. Clara Sutter stood at the edge of the Sutter property with her 3 children and pointed out every boundary marker to them, naming them one at a time, because these children would know what their father had built and what had been done to protect it. Mira Wren brought her 2 youngest to the land office in Jefferson City to watch the deed come back into her name, and the older one said, "This was Daddy's," and Mira said, "Yes, and now it's yours." Abigail was not present for most of these moments. She was in St. Louis. She had sent an application to the territorial bar the week after the assembly. Holt had written her a letter of support that was 3 pages long and included a forensic breakdown of her legal reasoning throughout the investigation that was more thorough than most recommendations she had read. The examination board had looked at her credentials, the 11 years of sitting at her father's table, the documentation she had built, and maintained the case record now in federal possession, and done something that had no precedent she was aware of in the territory. They had passed her. She received the news on a Tuesday morning in a St. Louis boarding house, sitting in the early light with a cup of cold coffee, and she sat with it for a long time, in the particular silence of someone receiving something they worked for, and discovering that receiving it does not feel like what they expected. It felt real. It felt earned. It felt like her father's voice saying documentation endures, but with a new word appended that she had not heard him say because he had not lived to say it. "You endure, Abigail." She folded the letter into her coat pocket next to the space where the journal had lived for 2 months, and she went out into the street. She rode back to Red Creek in October, when the summer had finally broken and the air had gone clean and cool, and the road looked entirely different, traveled toward a place rather than away from one. Wyatt was at the gate when she rode in. She didn't know if he had been watching for her or if he simply happened to be there, and she found that she didn't particularly need to know. He was there. She was here. The gate stood open. She got down off the horse. They stood and looked at each other across a few feet of Missouri morning, and she thought about the first time she had seen this face, the lamp and the rifle, and the door swinging open in the dark, the specific quality of a man who stepped aside and asked nothing. She thought about the note he had left on the kitchen counter. "If you're still here at supper, I'll take that as your answer." She thought about the porch and the dark, and it's a good observation. "You stayed," she said. "Said I would," he said. "I went to St. Louis." "I know. Cleet's been tracking your letters like a man who has nothing better to do, which he does not." He tipped his hat, that same brief, deliberate gesture. "How'd the examination go?" She reached into her coat and produced the letter. Held it out. He read it. Something moved across his face. Not surprise, she noted. Recognition. Like a man who expected a certain outcome and is satisfied to be proven right. He handed it back. "Your father would have—" "I know," she said. She put the letter back in her coat. "I know he would." They stood in the October morning for a moment, and then he said with the same unhurried directness he brought to everything, "I'd like to ask you something, if you're willing." Her heart did something she declined to analyze in real time. "Ask," she said. "This ranch," he said. "It's big enough, The work is real and it matters, and it's connected to this county in ways I've been trying to protect for a long time." He looked at her directly. "And I am not a man who says things he doesn't mean, so I want to say this plainly." He stopped, started again with the slight contained difficulty of someone for whom plainness about certain things costs more than plainness about others. "I'd like you to stay, not as a maid, not as a temporary arrangement or a place to work from. I'd like you to stay, because this place is better when you're in it, and I reckon I am too." The morning was very quiet around them. She thought about St. Louis, and the letter in her coat, and the 43 families, and her father's handwriting going shaky at the end. She thought about everything she had been carrying for 2 months, and what it had felt like to finally set it down. She thought about all the ways she had told herself she wasn't feeling anything, and how spectacularly she had been lying. "That's not an observation this time," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him, at the face that had stopped a door for her in the dark and had not asked why. At the man who had ridden 4 days hard to put her father's work in federal hands, who had stood in a corridor in the dark without making it about himself, who had sat beside her on more porches than she could count, and filled the silence with exactly the right amount of nothing. "All right," she said. It was 2 words. They were sufficient. He reached over and took her horse's reins, the simple, practical gesture of a man who has heard what he needed to hear and is moving forward. "Cleet made coffee," he said. "It's probably still hot." She fell into step beside him, and they went through the gate together. The land that Elias Turner had spent 11 years trying to protect did not become a memorial. It became something better. In the spring of 1819, on the parcel that had been her father's last documented case, 22 acres in the center of Red Creek County, fraudulently seized in 1815, formally restored in October of 1818, the families whose land had been returned pooled what they could and built a schoolhouse. It was not large. It was not elegant. It was the kind of building that gets built by people who have worked hard all their lives and build things to last, rather than to impress solid timber clean lines, a single room with enough windows to keep it bright. Above the door, on a piece of oak that Tom Dodd cut, and Clara Sutter's oldest son planed smooth, they carved 4 words: Turner School, Red Creek. No dates, no ceremony. Just the name, plain and permanent in the wood that would outlast all of them. Abigail stood in front of it on the morning it was finished and pressed one hand flat against the doorframe and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. Her father had believed that truth properly recorded and properly witnessed could not be permanently suppressed. He had believed that witnesses mattered more than power, that documentation endured longer than the men who tried to bury it, that justice was worth fighting for, even when, especially when fighting for it, cost everything. He had been right. The town had thought she was a broken servant running for her life with nothing but a dead man's notebook and a thin false name. They had been wrong. She was Abigail Turner, daughter of Elias Attorney of the Missouri Territory, wife of Wyatt Callahan. And she had finished what her father started, and she intended to spend the rest of her life making sure it stayed finished. She took her hand from the doorframe,